Welcome to episode 143 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined as always by my co-host, Dalton Willie, and producer, Johnny Pham. We have a fun show coming for you guys today, a little AFC and NFC South preview edition. Dalton and I each picked one storyline per team, and then we're going to try and fire through them in about 60 minutes. We will see how that goes. Guys, this is the last podcast we will do before EA Sports College Football comes out. And I, for one, could not be more excited about that. Post 4th of July means we're on like the dead sprint of fantasy football draft preview season. Just a lot of very exciting things happening right now.
Yeah, actually, with the release of EA Sports College Football, NCAA 2025, I did want to announce today on the podcast that I will be officially retiring from fantasy football creation and going full-time in the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers rebuild. So this will be my last one, boys. It's been a good ride.
Johnny, I thought you had dibs on Western Kentucky.
That's what I thought too, but I guess he just staked his claim live on the pod, so I guess I had no choice but to relinquish that to him and just watch him fail. But like Don, I'm very excited for the game to come out, and it's just gonna consume and destroy my world for the next few months or weeks.
So I said earlier today that Coastal Carolina is like my early favorite for my rebuild dynasty, partially because Ethan Vasco is the quarterback. Johnny,
Yeah.
do you
Dog.
think do you think Dalton knows who Ethan Vasco is?
No,
This is a test right
he's
here.
not. He's not
He
that
used to
tuned
play
in.
for KU.
Well, okay, he never played here, but he
Very
was
close.
supposed to. Yes, well, I guess that he did actually play like one game, so he was on the team and played half of one game. That was exciting. He's the guy who hit the water ball off someone's head from like 85 yards away.
That's what I was going to mention that clip. I was like, that's what I remember him mostly for.
Yeah, against Texas Tech, he had his debut. He completed 3 or 5 passes for 13 yards. He also rushed it 2 times for 6 yards.
You shouldn't have said that because now I'm pretty confident you only knew that he played for us because you Googled him as I was saying it.
I already knew who he was, but I wanted to add some context for the viewers who I know appreciate the good stats. You know, I can't just tell you he played a game. Everybody plays a game.
Not everybody.
Not
Not everybody plays a game.
I'll have you change that. At Kansas, everybody plays. At least that Kansas.
Well, okay. On that note, let's get to some guys who everybody knows. And also these guys, they play. They're relevant. We're talking fantasy football. We're talking AFC and NFC South previews. Dalton, let's start with the NFC South. And I'll go ahead and kick us off with my storyline. And to be clear, these aren't training camp storylines. These are just like fantasy football storylines that we think will define these teams this season. Or just like the most important one that we picked out, or whatever. There wasn't really a whole lot of rules for this outside of we're not looking at training camp stuff right now. We'll get to that. We'll get to that down the road a little bit, I'm sure. My number one for the Panthers is Bryce Young a starting caliber NFL quarterback? Is that yours?
Mine was, can Bryce Young be average? So, we're looking at the same storyline here.
Their offense was just a disaster last year. They were one of the worst in basically every statistical measure last season. Pass protection breakdowns, run blocking breakdowns, Bryce Young staring down receivers not getting open, Miles Sanders making mistakes in the running game, in pass protection, Chuba Hubbard being like perfectly just a guy, which is not really, when you have such a bad offense, you kind of want your running back to be able to be more than that because you need your running back to be more than that. And, I'm sure you may have pulled some stuff from this article because you're a big Nate Tice guy, but Nate Tice wrote a pretty in-depth Bryce Young breakdown a couple weeks ago with some pretty alarming Bryce Young stats. So last year, he was 34th among qualified quarterbacks in success rate, only above Tommy DeVito and Bailey Zappi last season. He was dead last in yards per pass attempt, and more alarmingly, his 3.68 yards per attempt was the lowest by any quarterback since Josh Rosen in 2018, which is, that is tough. And quarterbacks under 4 in that stat since 2011 include Blaine Gabbert, Blake Bortles, Jared Goff, Brett Hundley, Deshaun Kaiser, Carson Wentz, and that was 2020 Carson Wentz, so that was post ACL and back Carson Wentz, and Zach Wilson. So, like, he has all of that, but he also, at times, shows some of that creation ability, some of that anticipation over the middle passing that made him such a good college quarterback. And I'll let you go here before I take every Bryce Young and Carolina talking point, but I think there's really no other place to look besides here for the top Panther storyline.
Yeah, and I kind of broke this up into the good and the bad. So I'll keep going with the bad like you were. Last season, Bryce Young lost 230 yards to drops, which was 6th in the NFL. The total air yards for every pass TD he had on the season came out to 97 yards. So no explosive plays. Funny thing, second to last in the NFL. Last in the NFL was the Kansas City Chiefs. Funny.
They had no explosive plays, but also they had nobody who had any yak ability. Yeah. At least the Chiefs had, Kelsey has some at this point. Rashee Rice, great in that facet. Isaiah Pacheco, they at least could do that. Whereas they weren't even giving Bryce Young any yak. Not getting open, no yak, no nothing.
Yeah, and then I pulled some numbers from the Fantasy Pros data. So Bryce Young was 12th in attempts, but 19th in yards last year. You don't like to see that. He was He had 62 sacks, which was second in the NFL, only getting beat out by Sam Howell, who's now benched. Mm-hmm. And he was 26th in red zone attempts. He fell behind quarterbacks who didn't play full seasons in yards and red zone attempts. So the bad is pretty bad. Before we get to the good and we start talking about that, I do think this organization was elite dysfunction.
Yeah.
Urban Meyer level of dysfunction was going on in Carolina.
That's exactly what I was going to say, where it's can he kind of be the exception to the rule where it's a Jared Goff or a Trevor Lawrence, where the situation as far as coaching and system and everything goes from terrible to really good. And that's yet to be seen in Carolina, but we think that is maybe what could happen. And if that does happen, can he kind of maybe not live up to the 1.1, but can he just be pretty good? And that is the positive case for it, I think.
Yeah. And, as I look into this, I come away, if I'm answering my own question, I think he can be average. I think he can be a middle of the road, top 15 NFL starter. The first thing that I think is really important, they added 2 really good guards. Robert Hunt was top 7 in PFF grade last year, and Damian Lewis was top 40. And then you still have Ike Okonkwo, who was a top 10 pick. I think part of Okonkwo's issues last year was he was playing with a guard who wasn't experienced and made that left tackle position more difficult. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I've found interesting, and I'm not going to pretend to know a ton about this, but a lot of smart people, Nate Tice, Robert Mays, have talked about the importance of good guard play for small quarterbacks.
Yeah.
That was a staple of the Saints with Drew Brees. And adding these 2 guards and buffing up the interior offensive line keeps Bryce Young in the pocket more and gives him the better field of vision.
Yeah, so, he has the self-creation stuff, but one thing that he did a lot last year, and he did it in college too, so part of it is an offensive line problem, part of it is a Bryce Young problem. Obviously, if you address the offensive line, maybe it helps the Bryce Young problem, is he tries to do the Mahomes, Josh Allen back up out of the pocket and make throws. The problem is he does not have the arm strength to actually make those throws like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, that Justin Herbert, that classic guy.
Yeah, and that's kind of my next point. So I think they've shored up the offensive line to give him time. The next problem with this Carolina team was they were last in the NFL in separation among wide receivers. I'm obviously a big Deontay Johnson fan. The timing of this couldn't be more perfect because reception perception dropped in all green. Deontay Johnson. I think he's historically one of the most underrated wide receivers in the NFL, and his ability to separate gives Bryce Young that easy outlet. The additions of Xavier Legette is exciting at the very least, and the ability for Jonathan Mingo to hopefully work into a big slot position where he could be better off in the NFL. Give them some tools. Not to mention, I'm a big Jonathan Brooks fan. I think coming into the season, he won't be effective, but on the tail end, he could give Bryce Young that checked out outlet. So that's kind of the second part of the equation here is I think the weapons.
And he's a good pass protector as a running back, which helps too.
And kind of the last part of the whole Bryce Young hypothesis is I am just all in on David Canales. I think this man is a QB whisperer. Anybody who's listened before has heard these stats, but Russell Wilson, Geno Smith, and Baker Mayfield are all quarterbacks who under David Canales had their career best years. In 2018 and 2021, Geno Smith averaged his best yards, his best touchdown, and his lowest interception rate. Geno Smith, same story in Seattle. Baker Mayfield last year as well. The second part of that is all of those quarterbacks, excluding Baker because we don't know yet, got worse when David Canales left.
Yeah.
He got Baker to be the fastest time to throw of his NFL career. Like, he makes the processing easier for quarterbacks and makes the offense better, which I think is going to be huge.
And that was one of the things that worked for Carolina last year was the quick game. The problem is, they had no yak. And once teams just started cheating their safeties up, it got a lot more difficult. And a lot of the mistakes that Bryce Young was making last year, he was staring down receivers, doing that type of thing. He was also having to throw in incredibly tight windows. And when you're having to do that and make the adjustment to the speed of the game from from college to NFL, and you have an offensive line that is relenting a lot of pressure, there were just a lot of things that were difficult for him. And I think why this is so important is, number one, this is the 1.1 pick, so it's important in that regard. But for fantasy, Bryce Young, probably not going to be a guy we care about as a starting quarterback. But if Bryce Young doesn't take a meaningful step forward this year, I think we'll probably look back at the season for Jonathan Brooks and for Deontay Johnson and feel disappointed about how things went for them.
Yes, I will say, I think at cost for all those players right now, we're getting a massive discount.
Yeah.
And the second-year leap is something that he can take and that this organization has given him the tools to. And I would rather make that bet at Deontay Johnson's the highest drafted player on this team, an ADP of the 8th round.
Yeah.
And so you're still not taking a high risk. And Deontay Johnson is a receiver who's been a top 12 receiver. And again, I really think Bryce Young had the tools there. I really don't think this organization gave him the success. The last thing I'll say on this, before he left Indianapolis, Frank Reich coached one of the worst offensive line units. That Shane Steichen came in and made a top 5 unit. The same situation happened in Carolina last year. The Carolina offensive line was middle of the pack 2 years ago. The coaching staff with Frank Reich and company was a disaster for this offensive line. I don't think they're good at coaching offensive line play. And I think when that improves, a smaller quarterback like Bryce Young can get going with his game.
Yep. Okay, now that we have gotten to the 13-minute mark and we've talked only about the Carolina Panthers,
That's one of my biggest points. This is definitely one of the biggest storylines that I'm really into.
Yeah,
I own a lot of Panthers right now.
I think I have the most notes written down for this one. So, all right, the second one, let's go to Tampa. I'll start us off again here, and mine is Chris Godwin to the slot. Does this mean better and more consistent production in 2024? And this is one of the early storylines that we've been seeing bubbling up on Twitter in the last couple of months. The new offensive coordinator is talking about moving him to the slot, and he basically said that he'll play a similar position / role to Cooper Kupp. Now, this does not mean you take Cooper Kupp's production and put it on Chris Godwin, obviously, but Chris Godwin has been in the past more of a slot guy. The last couple of years, he's had to be more on the outside. And, last year he was above, his first 3 years, he was above 50% on the inside and clear up to 60%. And in one of those seasons, he played just 32% of his snaps in the slot last season. And even still last year, over 1,000 yards. The issue is he only had 2 touchdowns. He had 3 in 2022. He's never been a huge touchdown guy, but he's had 9 once, 7 twice, and 5 another time or two. So he's a guy who could very easily score 6 touchdowns, and you feel a lot differently about his fantasy season compared to 2 or 3, like he's done the last couple of years. And I think maybe we're going to learn with Godwin back in the slot this year that it wasn't Baker's fault that Godwin wasn't as effective as previous years. It was just, and maybe not even coaches too, maybe it's just what they had to do given the receiver room. But regardless, maybe it was just Godwin having to be outside more than really he should be. I mean, you look at last season, just yards per route run, 2.11 yards per route run from the slot, 1.64 on all others. He is a slot guy. Getting him back to that role kind of gets him into what he does best. And I'm excited to see what that could mean for both him and Mike Evans in this offense this year.
Yeah. This isn't my storyline, so thank God we're not doubling up. But some things I'll say about that. This is a great tweet from Davenport Fantasy Football. But in 2022, Godwin was first in the league in slot targets with 94. In 2023, he was 21st in the league with only 43. The PPR outcomes of those was he was 38th last year and 13th in 2022. So just to enforce your point, he's a very, very good slot receiver. It's where he gets his work done, and him returning to slot is an incredibly good move for him. And part of the reason, especially in the first half of the season, that he was playing all over the place is they didn't really have a solid number 3 receiver in this offense. Trey Palmer kind of came on late, had some touchdowns here or there, but wasn't a reliable option. I really like Jalen McMillan out of Washington. And I think it sounds like they want him to be their outside guy, which gives Godwin that full-time slot ability.
Which that is where this gets a little bit shaky, because like if you go read McMillan's reception perception profile, it's pretty much like, yeah, if this guy's Hunter Renfrow, a slot only guy, that would be a great outcome for him. So a little unsure about the personnel side of this, but the intent from Tampa seems to be there. So maybe this is a Trey Palmer, a Trey Palmer tweet instead of a Jalen McMillan tweet, as far as what they're looking to do with Godwin. Who really knows? But we'll see if they stick to it. But so far, I am enjoying the talk, and I hope it does happen, because I think it would mean good things for Godwin, and and Mike Evans will be Mike Evans every year.
Yeah, and Godwin was one of 3 receivers with 1,000 yards last year who didn't break the top 30, and that's all in the touchdown.
Yeah.
But like the talent to have a 1,000-yard season is still there, and I'm grabbing him at his ADP.
Yeah,
wherever I can.
Yeah. Okay, you're Tampa.
We can go quick on this one because we seem to beat up on this player all the time. But can Rachaad White fool us again? Is what I wrote down. Last year, Rachaad White as a rusher was absolutely horrendous. I don't mean that as a discount to him. I just mean like at rush yards over expectations from fantasy data. He was 41st out of 50 qualifying running back. Yards after contact, he was 48th out of 50 qualified running backs. Yet, in spite of all of this, he finished as a top 15 running back. Now, part of the reason he did it is because he is, just like we thought coming out of college, an incredibly good pass catcher. But part of the agenda that gets him here is he did have a good handful of rushing touchdowns last year. Despite his inefficiencies, he was the bell cow in this offense.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only do they have rushing touchdowns, he tied for second in the NFL in total rushes last year.
Yeah, and that's despite being incredibly inefficient. Now, let me say a few things here. I'm not a Bucky Irving believer. He's not a good player. But this coaching staff seems to talk about Bucky Irving like the 1-2 punch. Last year, you and I famously thought Sean Tucker could beat out Rachaad White for this position. We were very wrong on that. But
just wait. We'll see.
But we're coming into another season where this time it's not an undrafted free agent. It's a player they drafted. It's a player who, from all of the analysts I listen to and follow, runs like Rachaad White should run when he should play like Rachaad White plays. These players look different and play different to how they look. And
Bucky Irving is a pass catcher, right?
Yeah. And that can eat into Rachaad White's work. And at the end of the day, if these two start splitting it in like even a 60-40, it's very hard for Rachaad White to repeat last year's outcome because a lot of it was on an inefficient high touch volume.
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't even have to be a 60-40. If it's 75-25, that's still more than he gave up in last year's backfield. I'd have to imagine he is tied for second with Christian McCaffrey with 272 carries last season. And that's without me even looking at the passing stuff, which I know he had a lot of receptions last year too. So he was probably, if I had to guess, second in the NFL in total touches amongst running backs last year.
And then the only thing I'll say here, I spoke very highly of Canales just a second ago. Like, can Liam Cohen keep this offense elevated to a level where they're successfully able to have inefficient runs and still move the ball? And if those things don't work out, an inefficient back and an inefficient offense is a really hard sell for me, especially at his ADP of RB15 right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to the New Orleans Saints. Dalton, I'll let you go first this time.
So we might have the same one here. I have will Chris Olave break out this season?
No, we do not have the same one.
So it's right now, Chris Olave's ADP is wide receiver 11. And it's hard to wrap your head around that at first glance because his last 2 seasons, he's been wide receiver 25 and wide receiver 19. He's 12th in air yard share, 17th in target share.
I was gonna say, tell me about the air yards, Dalton.
Well,
how about the unrealized air yards?
I won't get into those. He's 18th in targets per route run, 20 in average up the target, 21st in yards per route run. So like those aren't bad numbers. Like they're top 24, but he's being drafted as like an alpha elite wide receiver 1 right now. Mm-hmm. So that's where my concern starts with Chris Olave, and we're drafting him for a breakout we haven't seen yet. And then I went down a spooky rabbit hole, Evan. So we know this offense was inefficient last year. It was terrible. It's one of the worst offenses to watch.
Yeah, it was like my least favorite team to watch last year.
Alvin Kamara had like 14 catches for 30 yards one game. Like, I don't know how you do that.
It really speaks volumes to Derek Carr that Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara are like probably 2 of my favorite skill players in the NFL, and yet this offense was one of my least favorite to watch last year.
So I got really interested in Clint Kubiak, who's the new offensive coordinator for the Saints, because I think we know Dennis Allen's a defensive coach and his OCs run the game. So I went back the last 3 years and looked at Kubiak when he was at other teams and what his wide receiver 1s did. 2021 was the last time he was an offensive coordinator. He was an offensive coordinator for the Vikings. Justin Jefferson had the best season of his career. It was obviously his breakout rookie season with 108 receptions, 1,600 yards, and 10 touchdowns. Okay, not going to write home about that because obviously
you've sold me. Thank you.
Obviously, JJ is great. So we go to 2022. He's the Broncos passing game coordinator, and I know what everybody's thinking. We're out. Well, guess what? Jerry Jeudy had the best career of his season with 67 receptions, 972 yards, and 6 TDs. So again, the wide receiver 1 in a Kubiak coach passing offense did really well. So let's go to 2023, where he moved to San Francisco and became the passing game coordinator. Yeah. Ayuk had 75 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Also a career best. Now, I'm not going to draw a 1-to-1 like that Clint Kubiak's going to be the godsend for the Saints offense, but I think he does a really good job at scheming up the wide receiver 1s in their offense. And looking at these numbers, I got pretty excited about the prospect of what Chris Olave can do and what a forward-thinking coach can bring to this offense.
Yeah, and here's what it kind of comes down to. I think Olave himself has to get a little bit better, be more consistent, do those sorts of things. That is not unusual for a young player to have to kind of make some tweaks around the edges. He's obviously one of the 10 or 15 most talented receivers in my mind and has shown those flashes. And then the other thing, if he's able to do that, the next part of it is, number 1, can Carr be good enough? And number 2, can he and Carr actually get on the same page? Because Carr has been good enough to prop up receivers to allow those receivers to earn top 15-ish type of seasons, like Devontae Adams, obviously a whole different level, but Michael Crabtree, Amari Cooper, those guys both had really good seasons with Carr. It's not like those Raiders teams outside of 1 year were like, oh my God, amazing. I love this offense. Yeah. So it is on the table for him. It will just come down to, can he and the quarterback get on the same page? Can the quarterback have a better season? And can he just have a little bit of a better season this year?
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about this isn't stat based, but Pete Carmichael and Dennis Allen were buddies. Pete Carmichael being the OC last year. And when Carr was, and this was clear, there's the play where Carr throws out of bounds and yells at Olave for not being there. Everybody saw that. I think having a new person in that room to be like, look, you're not doing it right. You need to be better about it. And to kind of give that speech to a player who I think is already losing his locker room is something that we can be hopeful about. And the last thing is there's no other target earners on this team. There's not a Rashid Shaheed is fun.
Yeah, I mean, he'll do a 3 for 80 every now and then, but he's not a high volume guy. Yeah. Kamara is the other high volume guy.
Yeah, who's entering an age 29 season on a contract here, so we'll see how that ends up for him.
Well, Dalton, I'm glad you said that because
boy, I'm excited.
My New Orleans storyline is: do we get any hints of what a post Alvin Kamara world might look like for this team? Do we get any of that this year? I just could not help but going down this road when I was, just doing some poking around, and I saw a quote from Alvin Kamara talking about the aforementioned Clint Kubiak, saying this offense is really good for running backs. It's this is not even me saying, Kamara is going to have a down year this year, but my brain goes to, I wonder what Kendre Miller could do in this offense with a little bit of an opportunity. And now I'm not saying he's overtaking Alvin Kamara. I'm not saying that's like what I'm looking out for, anything like that. But can he go from a guy who was injured most of the year? I think he only like had 2 games where he played real amount of snaps, which, by the way, one of them was a meaningless Week 18 blowout, and he had over 80 total yards. Another one was another blowout, but it was a like middle of the season game against the Patriots where he also had 80 total yards. So he produced in the chances he got last season. Liked him out of college, explosive player, good contact balance, can catch the ball, can kind of do a little bit of everything. And what is interesting with Kamara is what you mentioned. He's obviously 29. He is getting close to that point for running backs. He is entering the final year of his contract. He's already left the final practice of minicamp, and his agent said it was contract related. He says he wants to be there. We'll see what the team is willing to do. Like, it's hard to kind of figure out from a cap perspective what's going to happen here, because you can't really just say, oh, they're going to cut him next year because they can save anywhere from $19 to $25 million against the cap if they do. Because if he's back next year, it'll be on a new deal and that cap hit will be addressed. That cap hit only exists because his contract has been restructured not once, but twice already as a member.
Loomis special.
As a member of the New Orleans Saints. But I'm just very interested to see how Kendre Miller can or cannot get involved in this offense. Because if he is able to be, because, Kamara has always been a guy that has had another guy be able to be effective alongside him if there's another guy there. Like, can Kendre Miller be a 35% guy? And if he can, I know this offense, like, we're not excited about it. We're wrong about that stuff all the time, so maybe it's better than we think. But, like, if he turns into a guy who's on the field a third of the time, maybe like the Tajay Spears type of role from last year, can he have kind of a sneaky RB3 flex kind of season? And can that lead to, from a dynasty perspective, him kind of being the guy we look to next year in this backfield?
Yeah. And as far as I'm looking at it, I'm a big fan of taking Kendre Miller. He's RB41 on Underdog. Very cheap price. There were signs of Alvin Kamara getting worse last year. Just like I said with Chris Olave, this is partially offensive related. This offensive line in fantasy points ranks 28th in the NFL. It's not a good offensive line by any means. But Alvin Kamara showed signs of slowing down. We're past what we consider to be the running back age cliff. Can guys like outdo that? Is that stat a little overrated? Yes. Is there a large amount of hesitation from me that Alvin Kamara can repeat a top 10 season like he did last year? Yeah. Because a lot of it was volume based on really bad dink and dunk passes, and efficiency wise, he wasn't a good runner. Part of that's the offensive line, but at the end of the day, Kendre Miller is a guy they drafted very much so to be his replacement. Alvin Kamara and Jamal Williams were 2 of the worst rushers last year, so they're going to be looking for that juice. So yeah, I'm all in on Kendre Miller. I'm pretty with his ADP where it's at right now, I'm pretty out on Alvin Kamara. But as a whole, this Saints offense is something that's hard to take any bites of and feel confident in what you're getting.
Okay, how about the Atlanta Falcons, Dalton?
So mine here is, are we collecting our Pitts pittance? So we've had a couple years of Kyle Pitts in the NFL. Generational talent was thrown around a lot when he came into the NFL, and he definitely has not lived up to those expectations.
I'm pretty sure one of our first TikToks was Todd McShay telling him a generational talent like 4 times.
I believe it. And I think this is the year for Kyle Pitts. I hate that I have to say that again. But when you go and look at the Arthur Smith offense, so from 2021 to 2023, Kyle Pitts ran 48% of his routes against corners. That's the league high for tight ends by 8%. Next was Darren Waller, who his numbers are already a little inflated because he didn't even play a full season either of those years. The issue with that is that no matter how good a tight end is, they do not match up against corners as well as they match up against linebackers. That's been the MO for some of the best tight ends, like even Travis Kelce. They want him on safeties. They want him on linebackers. It's where these players make their money. So at the top, I think that bringing in Zach Robinson and bringing in a new offense is going to line Pitts up outside of being a wide receiver in a lot of these situations. The second part is just the abysmal quarterback play. Said it before, I'll say it again. Ritter and Heineke were outside the top 25 in accuracy ratings. They threw a lot of balls. The balls really didn't go anywhere. Kirk Cousins, top 10 in accuracy. Like, there's just such a major improvement here that where Pitts is going, which is outside the top 5 tight ends, I think he has a good shot at returning that, especially considering he is the number 2 pass catcher on this team going into this year.
Yeah, and my Atlanta storyline kind of goes into that. I don't want to talk too much about it because I feel like we've already done the Kirk Cousins thing like multiple times. But like, it's just, what does Kirk Cousins do for this offense? And specifically, the guys you think of are the pass catchers, Drake London and Kyle Pitts. Like, Bijan will obviously be better if his quarterback is better, but those two pass catchers, they really have a lot riding on just how healthy is he. Like, we've talked about it again. You know, he's old. He's coming off the Achilles. He has it in the leg that is more concerning than Rodgers. It obviously happened after Rodgers too. So like, we'll see what he looks like. I will say, in the past 6 seasons, Kirk Cousins has supported 8 wide receiver 1 seasons. So like, you know, pretty good. He's been pretty good as far as supporting fantasy assets. Now, obviously, he's had some great ones in Justin Jefferson and Stephon Diggs, and Adam Thielen in his prime was definitely nothing to sneeze at either. But like, Drake London and potentially Kyle Pitts both have the ability to not be in the Justin Jefferson class, maybe even the Stephon Diggs class, but like the Adam Thielen class, like that, you know, probably more realistic for both those guys as far as where they're at positionally. And before his injury last year, Kirk Cousins was leading the league in passing touchdowns. He was second in passing yards. That Vikings offense was incredible. It was just their defense that could not stop literally anybody as to why they weren't any good even with Kirk Cousins last year. But again, it's really mostly going to come down to health and what he looks like. Now, I will say, the good thing is, I think, you know, you think back to like going from Anthony Richardson to Gardner Minshew. If you have to go from Kirk Cousins to Michael Penix at any point this year, I think that style will be pretty much the same. That offense will be pretty much the same. So I'm really just like, by and large, interested in what this offense looks like, what the system looks like, what they can do to scheme both these guys open. Like, can we get Drake London on some more crossing routes? Like, he was really, really good at USC at crossing routes. And I just feel like we have not seen nearly enough of that in the NFL. And you already said all with Pitts as far as getting him in advantageous matchups, because yes, a tight end who's a super freak is an advantage when he's playing against guys who are supposed to be covering tight ends, a little bit less so when he's playing against a lockdown cornerback, unless he's Travis Kelce or Gronkowski, basically.
Yeah, and you can even look at what happened with TJ Hawkinson last year.
Yeah.
Coming from Detroit, he was somebody that people liked as a tight end, but he wasn't valued as like a top 5. Had it not been for an ACL tear this offseason or late last season, Hawkinson would be a lock to be a top 5 tight end. Like, It's a position, takes a while to learn. Kyle Pitts, I think he's 22 years old, maybe 23, super young. Like, very excited about this offense going forward and what a good head coach can do for them.
I'm looking right now. Kyle Pitts is 23. He'll be 24 in October. So still quite young. Okay.
I think a friend of the show, Eli Beery, is subtweeting / sending me DMs about he's just sent me only 5 running backs average greater than 5 targets last year. Alvin Kamara led the league with 6.6 targets. So if you are listening, Eli, I see your tweet. Alvin Kamara still might be washed.
Okay. On to the AFC South. Let's start with Dalton's favorite team, the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, Dalton, are you going to give us an Anthony Richardson storyline, or are you going with a wild card, something different here?
Because I wanted to be able to skip over some things, this is an Anthony Richardson storyline. I just want to know how high he can take this offense. He famously, for those who follow, Scott Barrett does an Exodia list every year. Last year, he was on Scott Barrett's Exodia list. This year, he'll probably be on Scott Barrett's Exodia list. Those are just players who break fantasy football, who win you weeks. I'm not going to bore the people again. Last year, in the games he did play, Anthony Richardson was very, very, very good for fantasy. He played 3 quarters and was QB1 on the week with 27.7 points. If this offense is in the red zone more often, last year they were 17th in red zone scoring. This year, I feel like they could be a top 10 offense with Richardson and Jonathan Taylor playing together. If those things happen, the three big assets on this team, being Richardson, JT, and Pittman, could very well all have nuclear seasons in fantasy. And lastly, Shane Steichen is such a great quarterbacks coach. He did it with Justin Herbert his rookie year. He did it with Jalen Hurts his best career year. Like everywhere Shane Steichen has gone and come from, he has coached up his quarterbacks to be their best selves. So I'm very excited about where this offense goes.
One thing I found, and this isn't even like saying anything, but it's just like as we're thinking about the Colts and maybe winning that division and all of that stuff, one thing that I don't even know if I want to say alarmed by, but just kind of caught off guard by, I was looking and couldn't help but notice, the 2 full games that Richardson played last year, they lost. He's yet to start and finish an NFL win. So that was a little bit of a maybe step back on the thinking about the Colts as a team. My storyline does kind of coincide with Richardson, but I'm looking more at the guy who he's going to be sharing that backfield with, and Jonathan Taylor. And I really just want to know, is Jonathan Taylor going to have the requisite usage to still have that overall running back 1 upside? Not RB1 upside. He's obviously like a top 5 or 6 running back in ADP. That's where we have him ranked, all that. But does he still have the upside to finish as the overall RB1? I mean, he's kind of in that same sort of spot that Saquon Barkley was in a couple years ago, where he had a couple of injury-filled seasons outside. Like, he's been outside the top 30 each of the last 2 years, hasn't rushed for 1,000 yards since he had the overall RB1 season in, what was that, 2021, where he rushed for like 1,800 yards or something ridiculous like that. And I mean, the offense just looks a lot different than the last time we saw fully unleashed Jonathan Taylor for a whole season. Obviously, Anthony Richardson at quarterback. He was so good for fantasy for the 2 full games he played, and even like was on pace to be quite good in some of the other games he didn't. Like, yeah, he rushed for 2 touchdowns against the Texans. 6 of 10, 56 yards, but he had 2 rushing touchdowns, so I would have to bet he was still like QB2 despite playing half of that game. But what does that look like with Jonathan Taylor? Like, what is the rushing split inside the 5, inside the 10, or just like in general? What does that rushing split look like? Those two have legitimately never played a game together. Jonathan Taylor was not healthy any of those games.
They played 1 snap together, actually.
Was it 1 snap? Okay,
so 1 snap.
So they played 1 snap. So we have literally no sample size to go off of. And like, this is not great process. I'm not saying take this to the bank, but you look at the running back receptions in the 2 full games that Richardson played. Like, Deion Jackson goes 5 for 14 in week 1, but Moss had no receptions in the 1 game they played together. Evan Hull 1 for 0 yards in one of the. So like the throwing to the running backs wasn't really a part of the arsenal in that very limited sample. So not saying that to say it won't be, but just like, this is a big fat unknown what the usage will look like. Now, we know Jonathan Taylor, once he was healthy last year, he looked like week 7 on. He was, I believe, 3rd in the NFL in touches per game at like 21. He was behind CMC and Kyren Williams. Like, he's going to have volume, but just how high value are those touches that he's getting is kind of the biggest question outside of the quarterback in this offense to me this year.
Yeah, and what I will say, and if this offense hits right, which I really think it will if anybody can't tell, Richardson learns to take his checkdowns, doesn't run out of the pocket when he doesn't have to. Those checkdowns funnel to Jonathan Taylor. I mean, there's no one else on this team that's going to be in the backfield, in my opinion.
I mean, are you forgetting about second-string running back Trey Sermon?
Yeah, okay. Let's not derail this entire podcast on 4 years of wasted investment on your and I's part with Trey Sermon. But I think like this could be like a Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson kind of split where those guys are both just moving the ball up and down the field so efficiently that both guys are getting their work, and it's going to be great.
Yeah, it very well could be. It's just like I feel like it is so it is very unique to not have a running back going to a new team of this caliber. It's the same team, but I just have no idea of kind of what things will look like.
Yeah, and it's going to be a very different team.
Yeah, and again, I know he's going to get work. It's just, does he get the work you want in the passing game? Does he get the work you want inside the 5? The skill set indicates yes, he should. It's just like, how do things split between him and the quarterback. And at least a little bit interesting is he was about half a reception less per game last year than he was in his RB1 overall season. So like he already was just a little bit down in that regard last year. Would like to see that tick back up. And that's with Gardner Minshew, who like, yeah, he likes to sling it, but he's also not going to scramble as much as Richardson. So he will check it down too.
For sure.
All right. Tennessee Titans. I feel like we may be going to the same place here, but I guess we'll see. And it's just, how does this backfield shake out in Tennessee? And
can we call this backfield?
And specifically for me, it's like, I think we know it's going to be some kind of split. Almost all backfields are, but obviously, what is it? Is it a 60-40? Who's a 60? Who's the 40? But the confusing thing when trying to think about this backfield is like, I'm not sure which guy I think is going to do which thing. They could both be the pass catcher. They could both be the in between the tackles guy. Maybe one of them ends up being both those things, and the other guy is the backup in both those things. Maybe like, it's just so interesting to me. Usually in a backfield, you have like, okay, this guy is the first and second down guy. He can catch you a little bit, and then we kind of have the more ancillary piece who he's the pass catcher. He can get them between the tackles a little bit if we need him to. And then there's a lot of overlap between these two guys that makes it really hard, number one, to know just the percentages of how this will split. And number two, like, who's going to be in what role. Like, Tony Pollard was awful inside the 5-yard line last year. 13 carries, 3 touchdowns. One of those was a meaningless Week 18 touchdown for fantasy purposes. So really it was like 11 carries and 3 touchdowns. But Tajay Spears had 3 carries inside the 5 all last year because Derrick Henry was there. So like, we don't really know. Like, I don't know. There's just so much unknown about how that usage is going to split up. And these guys are also at very different points in their career. Like, one of them is an up-and-comer. One of them, even though he's coming off of 2 straight 1,000-yard seasons, we feel pretty bad about how last year went relative to expectation. He's 27. He's kind of right on that age where maybe things start going a certain way, but we'll see. We'll see. I just having a really hard time figuring out what to do with this backfield.
Yeah, and so am I, and that's my talking point here. The first thing that stands out to me and that makes this an even scarier proposition on this backfield, in his time at Cincinnati, Brian Callahan was like a one running back horse. It was Joe Mixon, 70%, 80% of the snap share, all the way up to 90% one year. So Joe Mixon was the guy. Now, can that tendency change? Absolutely. But if you're taking bets, and the way these bets look like at ADP right now is that people are just kind of throwing their hands up. They're back-to-back in ADP, and you're picking one. Mm-hmm. And you're taking those bets, and one of these guys could work out and one could not. Great insights there, right? But the problem is, if we don't get a 50-50 split and one of these guys ends up being the guy, then this backfield becomes really valuable because it's a good offensive line. And more importantly,
and like, Will Levis is decent enough to where I think this, and they have good enough weapons at receiver where I think this will be an okay offense. Like, we're not looking at a wasteland type of offense this year. I don't think injuries.
I do think this is going to be a very run heavy offense. I'm not going to buy in.
But that's not what Callahan's saying, which I know is what you're about ready to say.
I know, but Will Levis is bad. I think he's bad. I feel confident saying he's bad. But like, the hardest part for me is just evaluating Pollard. I'm a firm believer, and I think I can say this confidently. Tajay Spears is good. Like, he's a good player. He's the first player ever to take Derrick Henry off the field and to put him down to his lowest snap percentage of his career. Mm-hmm. Age be damned. But last year, if you look at the split where Tony Pollard said he felt better after week 11, it's really indicative. From PFF, weeks 1 through 10, his rushing grade was 65th. He was 39th in the NFL in rushing grade. Weeks 11 through 18, he was first in the NFL according to PFF in their rushing grade. Yards after contact, he went all the way up from 29th to 13th. Mm. Just across the board, all of his splits go up. And if that's the case, and like, we get 2 years ago Tony Pollard this offense, it becomes really difficult for me to tell you like Tajay Spears is that good, because that's a really good Tony Pollard. Now,
and this, like, that's a prime example. Like, the uncertainty really breeds opportunity here, because if we were to get that Tony Pollard and you're drafting him where he's going right now, like at the league winner,
You're making a
yeah,
lot of money. So I think like my best advice is take shots at both of them. Where their ADPs are, they're still severely undervalued. And behind this offensive line with really good tackles and one of the best offensive line coaches, it's going to work out for whoever gets the most touches. And it'll probably work out for both of them in some context. But if one of these guys goes down and becomes if Pollard goes down and Spears is the guy, you have like a weekly top 15 start option that you're getting outside the top 25.
Yeah, and I would personally rank him higher than that.
The only thing, and I'm just going to throw this out there, the only player on this running back roster who doesn't do what they do is Dylan Johnson out of Washington.
Stop it.
He's like the bruiser who you would think would be their like red zone back. And if we get into like a three-headed monster situation,
that's good for nobody.
It's good for nobody. But a player to watch for, like week one, if you see him getting some of their red zone work, maybe worth a pickup. But that's not it.
Do you know? Okay, so if you take the entire season last year, Tony Pollard, include that meaningless week 18, Tony Pollard had 13 carries inside the 5 and only had 3 rushing touchdowns. Can you guess the only other guy with double-digit carries inside the 5 and 3 or fewer rushing touchdowns last year?
Can I get the conference?
NFC.
I feel like this is just us ragging on Alvin Kamara again.
No. But another guy that we do like to rag on this show. He changed teams in the offseason.
Is it No, Devin Singletary is not in the NFC.
No.
Who is it?
DeAndre Swift.
Oh,
he had 10 carries inside the 5 and scored twice. There was a lot of tush-push, but maybe try and score more than 2 of 10 of your carries inside the 5, buddy.
That's terrible.
Okay, the Houston Texans, which one of the most exciting teams to talk about. Probably, I know we'll talk a lot more about them going forward. Dalton, what is your storyline on this day, the We Hate Joe Mixon day on Twitter?
It's so funny. It's We Hate Joe Mixon day. And forgive me because this is going to be the longest spiel I have today. But the question is, can CJ Stroud support 3 top 30 receivers? Very important question because Stephon Diggs is wide receiver 23, Nico Collins is wide receiver 13, and Tank Dell is the 25th wide receiver off the board. So we're drafting like that's going to happen. The last time there were 3 1,000-yard receivers in the NFL was 2008 with the Cardinals with Anquan Bolden, Fitzgerald, and Preston. So it's been a long time. Now that's important because to be a top 30 wide receiver, you basically need 1,000 yards. The players who didn't get it last year were Deebo Samuel, Jordan Addison, who had 10 touchdowns, Jaden Reed, who had 10 touchdowns, 2 of those being rushing, and then 119 rushing yards. So him and Deebo did similar things. And then Jacoby Myers, who had 8 touchdowns. The other 2 players in that top 30 were Rashee Rice and Zay Flowers, who were at wide receivers 28 and 29, which both would be disappointments at ADP for any of these wide receivers in Houston for where they're being taken. So CJ Stroud is going to need to support 3 top 30 receivers and more than likely throw 3 1,000-yard receivers. It's worrisome because if you break down his 17-game pace, he was on pace for 4,600 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 33 attempts a game. 33 attempts a game would put him at 22nd in the NFL among teams last year. And Bobby Slowick comes from the Shanahan tree where they want to run the ball. First and second down runs were a problem for this team last year. I don't really see what's going to envision them to change it. So I really think, and I believe this strongly at this point in the research I've done, that there are going to be some major disappointments with this Houston Texans team. I think every guy's going to have a week here or there. I think someone's going to come out as top dog, probably Nico Collins. But among all of them, I think a lot of people might be left holding the Tank Dell bag where he's the odd man out in this offense who just doesn't get enough work. And it's just really wild. We're taking the second-year option of CJ Stroud and really, like, he's being elevated to an echelon of being able to support 3 top 3 wide receivers when we haven't seen that done in 16 years. Like, that's a big ask for a receiver and a big step to take for an offense.
Yeah, and so 2 things on that. One thing that will help is, on this, Joe Mixon hate day. Couldn't help noticing that CJ Stroud does not throw to his running backs very much, college or NFL. So probably that Joe Mixon receiving work, kind of that garbage work he got in Cincy on dump downs, that will probably be, a lot less this year. So like the target volume should really be like those three guys and then a little bit of Dalton Schultz. Maybe this just turns into a like, what are we doing with Dalton Schultz? He's tight end 18 because it's just these three guys in the receiving game. Maybe that's the trickle down, or maybe it is one higher up. And what you're talking about kind of goes into my storyline here, which is just what does Stephon Diggs have left in the tank? I think is probably the defining storyline for me for Houston, thinking about this receiver room, because like you look at it, obviously Tank Dell was really fun last year. He's a really good player. He's got room to improve. He's very young, all of that. Like Nico Collins is going to be the dude in this room. And it's just going to be, can those other two guys, can they both be good enough to live up to ADP? Is one of them going to be good and one not? Or are they both going to be like so close to equal that both of them are a little bit meh compared to like where you have to draft them? Because you look at Nico Collins, I just had it pulled up and it went away. He was like one of, oh my gosh, now I can't find it. Oh, here we go. So over the past 10 seasons, there have been 8 receivers who have run 300 or more routes and had 3 or more yards per route run. In 2023, Nico Collins became the youngest to ever do it, as per Jacob Gibbs. On Twitter, the other guys on that list, Brandon Ayuk last year, Julio Jones twice, Cooper Kupp in the Triple Crown year, Tyreek Hill in 2022, Julio Jones, and then Tyreek Hill again last year. So, like, pretty exclusive and big-time list. It's like, set him aside, he's the guy. Stephon Diggs last season is just such a weird one to try and look at and decipher. His 70 yards per game, that was the fewest since 2018 in Minnesota. He was at 51 yards per game in his last 11 games last year, which if you do the math, that's over half the season. That's quite a large chunk of the season last year. He never reached 75 yards in that stretch after having 100 or more yards in 5 of the first 6 games. Now, the offensive coordinator change may not have helped matters for Diggs, but the struggles already kind of started 3-4 weeks before Joe Brady took over for Ken Dorsey. Like, was it age? Was it unhappiness? Was he banged up? Like, I don't really know. Like, it's just hard to say. You look at the reception perception, and I'm glad that we at least have this to look at. There's a few things that stand out. Number one, 54% of his snaps were either off the line of scrimmage or in the backfield last season, which is by far the highest rate since he got there. This is all per Matt Harmon of reception perception. 54% of the snaps were off the line, and then 35% of his snaps were in the slot or the backfield. So deployment changes like this, like we've seen it with Keenan Allen, we saw it with like Larry Fitzgerald, that just kind of comes when guys get older and a little bit more limited. But also you're going from a guy who was from 2020 to 2022 above the 90th percentile in man, zone, and press man. Last year, he was 73, 81, and 75% success rates. They're all below the 90th percentile, but all still very good. Like, basically, I went and looked at Jaden Reed's. It's like him and Stephon Diggs were almost the same guy looking at success rates last year, and we are very pumped with good reason about Jaden Reed, and we're feeling pretty meh about Stephon Diggs. I think the answer is we are getting a still very good but not great Stephon Diggs, and I think the answer is probably he's the 2 and Tank Dell is the 3, but what if Stephon Diggs drops off again next year? Or what if he, like Keenan Allen, kind of had a bounce back last year when he was healthy compared to previous years? Like, I think just what does Stephon Diggs have in the tank in a new situation is really going to shape how this offense looks like behind Nico Collins in this passing game.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that's where the competition comes from. Just to kind of lend more credence to, I think Nico Collins, he's out wide. Last year, he was split out wide 80% of the time.
Yeah, he's pure X.
Yeah. Diggs last year, like you said, 35% of his snaps were in the slot, 63% were out wide. Tank Dell, a very similar split with 28% in the slot and 70% out wide. So the competition really comes down to those two. And the concern is, when you get to like the wide receiver 26 range, it gets really, really nitpicky what makes a wide receiver 28 and like a wide receiver 50.
Mhm.
So if you just look at last year, like I said earlier, Jacoby Myers was the wide receiver 28. His stats came out to 800 receiving yards, 71 catches, and 8 touchdowns. Josh Downs was the wide receiver 50 with 758 receiving yards, 68 catches, and 2 touchdowns. The only difference in their outcomes was touchdowns. And did Josh Downs have a bad season? No. Could Tank Dell have a very similar season where he's the odd man out on the touchdown luck that this offense is rolling? Yes. And I think that
or based on how last year went for Tank Dell, could he have 750 yards and 11 touchdowns? Yes, he could. They would do that because he caught a lot of touchdowns last year.
But that would also, in all likelihood, his odd game percentage, CJ Stroud was on pace for 26 touchdowns last year. Like CJ Stroud would also have to significantly improve his passing touchdown output, which is possible. Yeah. All of it's possible. But we're taking a high bet on this Texans offense. And I think my answer is I'm out on most of the offense, excluding Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs because he's wide receiver 23 right now.
Well, we'll get to the I know we're gonna get to some Joe Mixon takes later in the offseason, but I would just like them to throw the ball a lot more this year. If they threw the ball like as much as the Chiefs, then it would probably be okay. Like we can probably support three top 34 receivers, and that's okay because yeah, the aggregate finish matters, but there's going to be weeks where one or two of those guys misses and the other, like the guys that play, they're going to win you weeks. So like some like those Diggs and Tank Dell both have the potential to be more valuable than their aggregate finish by the end of the year because of stuff like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the same vein, maybe Noah Brown has some value.
he was good to end last year when there was, virtually nobody else.
That is so true.
There, but he was pretty good. All right, the last team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'll lead this off with, I know, one of Dalton's favorites on his dynasty team right now, and that is Brian Thomas. Can Brian Thomas Jr. unlock this Jags offense as a rookie? We've talked about it a lot in the context of Calvin Ridley, that they took Calvin Ridley, who is a flanker, and tried to make him a pure X receiver last year, and it did not work because probably what is the biggest weakness in Ridley's game? He's not that big, and he can get swallowed up by, those guys on the outside if you just put him out there and say, get open. And that happened a lot. That led to a lot of plays where Trevor Lawrence is throwing the ball 10 yards over Ridley's head, and the guy is like inside Calvin Ridley's helmet. He's so close to him. And the offense was just discombobulated. Now, obviously, the offensive line was very bad. That was part of it too. But now you have Brian Thomas Jr., and I'm not saying he's a better player than Ridley. At this point, he's probably not. But you look at that specific role that can kind of maybe help unlock this offense. It is that X receiver on the outside. That's what he profiles as. And, we have Gabe Davis. Maybe he is kind of the guy a little bit at the beginning of the season. You hope from a ceiling perspective for both Thomas and just for this offense that is eventually him running a majority of, or running more of those routes than Gabe Davis. Like you look at his reception perception sample from college, basically he was on the line about 70% of his snaps. So like pure X guy in college, 83rd percentile against press man coverage, again, in college. But this is a guy that has the tools that make you think he can really hack it as an X receiver. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the prospects. 67% of his routes were either slant, curl, or 9 route. So, like, we could be getting a DK Metcalf pure boundary receiver.
But to be fair,
limited
had almost the same split because I think Jaden Daniels, we'll talk about him on the NFC East breakdown, might just be a limited quarterback.
That's part of it, too. And I'm not using that as a knock on Thomas, but it's just like that's what he can do to help open up this offense, which, number one, if he pops, it's good for him. And number two, I think that would be great for this offense because you have Christian Kirk who like does all of the dirty work underneath. He can be like a vertical slot guy from time to time, and Evan Ingram. So it's like you have the guys who could really eat if they're given that space underneath. And I think that's the vision with Brian Thomas. And if that does happen, then we feel better about Trevor Lawrence probably. And Christian Kirk, already one of my favorite values in drafts. And he really, really, really ends up being a value probably. And then Evan Ingram, like he's going probably about where he should be, but you're probably happy about it if and it could be even better if things go well with the X receiver in this offense.
Yeah, and I think he fits better into this offense than Calvin Ridley does from a role standpoint. Obviously, we don't know, like we can never tell you the talent's there, but for what they wanted Ridley to do for most of the season, Thomas does it. Just some fun points about him. Obviously, he led college in receiving touchdowns with 17 last year. He's an early declare wide receiver, which is always good to see. And then the most intriguing thing
He's very young, right?
yes,
He's like very young.
the most intriguing part to me, had Xavier Worthy not ran a 4.22, a lot more people would be talking about Brian Thomas's 4.33 on his 40. 40 is not everything, but he's 60 pounds heavier than Xavier Worthy and runs incredibly fast. He has that DK Metcalf archetype, like you said. Still a very raw player, in my opinion. Still has a lot of things to work on. But, the first step of the way is beating Gabe Davis. Now, if he can't beat Gabe Davis, that's a concern. That's a big concern.
Yeah.
But he fits well with the archetypes in this offense. Slot Kirk, Evan Ingram's check down king. Like, I like how it works out, and it gives Lawrence that option. Nate Tice has said this, but he really wants Lawrence to play with more reckless abandon and kind of being one of those chuck it quarterbacks because he has it. And this could be the player to unlock that caliber for him.
Yeah, and I think if Thomas isn't ready, if it's like Gabe Davis, please save us. I think this could look a lot like it did last year for Jacksonville, which like it worked out for ETN fine, but that was really about it.
Yeah, Evan Ingram.
Well, I say that like the stats for Ingram and Kirk and like it was all fine, but it could be a lot better than fine if like this one thing goes a lot better this year. I think.
It could uncap a lot of defenses for them.
Yeah.
Mine here was Trevor Lawrence's 2023 season an aberration. This is like one of the biggest discrepancies between film and stats right now. Are people who think Trevor Lawrence is bad.
That's been like the Trevor Lawrence experience for his entire career, it feels like so far. Obviously the film was very bad his first year, but it's always been like a film versus like, let's look at how bad the advanced stats are with Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah. And I'm stealing this from Robert Mays, who tweeted this out today. But the Jags last year were 9th in dropback success rate, but somehow they finished 17th in the NFL in EPA per dropback. And really what that discrepancy signals is they ran so cold on so many plays. There are so many drops from this wide receiver core. Tank Bigsby, like standalone, I think he caused 3 interceptions for Trevor Lawrence, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And they had so many.
He had a real Kadarius Toney type season out of Tank Bigsby.
And Tank Bigsby had like 8 snaps on the field at one point, and he was just a huge liability. If you go watch like the Kansas City Chiefs Jacksonville Jaguars game, there's so many missed opportunities by that offense.
Yeah.
And so that's the first part. The second part is starting from week forward on. Trevor Lawrence had 17 different injuries listed on the injury report. Like he was incredibly banged up, and I don't think he was fully healthy. And then the last thing, Bill Barnwell today released his like annual playmaker ratings. I really encourage anybody who subscribes to ESPN to read it. But I just wanted to get this snippet he wrote about the Jags because he said, the key players for the Jags aren't dominant playmakers. Etienne's good all around, but he isn't Christian McCaffrey. Christian Kirk racked up plenty of receiving yards, battling injuries, but he's really just a slot receiver, doesn't do much. And Evan Ingram's path to Pro Bowl consists entirely of checkdowns.
Yeah.
This is the funny stat. No wide receiver or tight end had more catches that didn't add expected points to his team's total than Evan Ingram last season. His average air target traveled just 4.7 air yards, which is 103rd out of 104. All of those guys are fine, but this Jaguars offense is missing that explosive option, which we think Brian Thomas might be. But everything went wrong for them in so many ways last year. And I think a lot of it is not to the fault of Trevor Lawrence. And like this offensive line's still bad. But I think last year his season was a bit of an aberration. He's still like a top 15 quarterback in my mind, probably higher if I had to rank some guys out there. Yeah. And if this supporting cast clicks, we could finally see like the prince we were promised when he was drafted number 1 overall.
I hope so. Like he is just one of those guys that the flashes are tantalizing, but it's almost like the the Trevor Lawrence looking befuddled at the camera at the sideline is kind of like the Doc Rivers meme face of the NBA.
Yeah.
If anybody's familiar, it's like, man, I am so tired of seeing that. I just want to see this guy go out and rip it every week because you see the flashes. Like, he should be better than he is. A lot of it has not been in his control, but also, he's just got to be better too. So hopefully the O-line is better. Hopefully, things with Brian Thomas work out that can kind of provide some explosiveness and just some room to breathe for this offense. Because at the end of the day, we think back to the player we care most about in fantasy. If this offense is better and like just more functional this year, Travis Etienne could have a really, really nice year this year.
Yeah. And like you said, big player I'm targeting in all my drafts here is Christian Kirk. I think no matter how this offense plays out, he's going to do such a good job. Like Brian Thomas.
What was he? He was like a fringe wide receiver 1 the year before Ridley got there.
Yeah. And he just fits so well. Like he can command 13 targets a game and give you a good week. I think even as somebody who loves Brian Thomas, like this is a 7 target a game player right now and big play potential. But Kirk is just going to be so consistent. And I think him finishing in the top 20 isn't something I would be unexpected to see.
Yep. Agreed, Dalton. Anything else to say before we jump out of here?
Nope. Next week we'll be potting, but I'll be running my NCAA Dynasty as we're potting probably. So
so we're gonna have a little Monday pod. I think is the plan next week because I'm gonna be out of town for a little bit. We'll be like a little bit off schedule as far as days of the week for a couple weeks, but we'll still be getting a weekly podcast to you. We're gonna do all the divisional previews just like this. We'll do the North, AFC, NFC, whatever. We'll do each division from each conference for each show. So it should be a lot of fun. Thank you guys all so much for listening to episode 143 of the Half Point Per Podcast. Give us a follow, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Half Point Per Pod. Subscribe to the YouTube. The link to all those things is in the show notes as always. If you are going to be on PS5 on NCAA, shoot us a DM. We've probably got some Dynasty spots available for those of you who we know who are interested in that sort of thing. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.